Hello, and welcome to the Open Source Hangout, where we discuss the development of open source software. This episode is live streamed on August 6, 2014 at 9 p.m. Central Time, and we stream it every Wednesday at that time. I'm your host, Sean Massa. I'm a software engineer at Groupon, and this week's co-host is Trek.
I'm also a software engineer at Groupon, and I'm part of the Ember.js core team, so I do quite a bit of open source.
Awesome, and we're joined by an awesome panel this week. We have Andrew.
Hey, I work for Harvest. We do time tracking and invoicing, but today I'm going to be talking about Connect Assets, which is a node module that I maintain.
And Brian.
Hello, I'm Brian Ford. I work at Google on the AngularJS core team.
Sean?
And we have Matthew.
Hey, I'm Matt. I work at Smarty Streets. So my open source projects are Papa Parse and Go Convey.
And Paul. Hey, Paul.
You're muted, dude.
I'll have to come back to Paul. How about Robert?
Yep, I am a software engineer at Dockyard. We're a full-stack consultancy. We do a lot of Ember stuff. I'm also on the Ember core team and participate in quite a few open source projects.
Awesome. Do we have Paul back? I'm sorry, we can't hear you. Let us know if your mic starts working.
Very strange.
Well, that's great. So first we're going to do some news, and then we'll go into our primary topic for the day. First up on the news is Trek. You actually started this project last weekend, I believe, called Beautiful Open. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I like open source. I also like well-designed things, and I have been collecting a list of sort of well-designed promotional sites, I guess, for open source or documentation sites for open source. And I've had that list for like a year, and it's basically I wanted to do something like what Bootstrap has with Bootstrap Expo. It was the thought of putting together a site was just like CSS, and I hate CSS and design, and despite liking design, I'm really bad at it. And then another group of people came out with a inspired by Bootstrap Expo called Built with Ember, which is like a list of sites that are pretty impressive built with Ember.js. And they essentially just copied the Bootstrap Expo site. And I was like, oh, that's a thing you can do. So I also copied the Bootstrap Expo site and started releasing the lists I've been gathering for a couple of years of well-designed open source pages. There's a lot of good stuff out there. It's really it's cool to have watched this evolve, because 4 or 5 years ago, open source pages all looked like they were designed by engineers. They were pretty abysmal, and now I feel like people won't even take your open source project seriously until you have a cool site, even for like little projects. So I'm very envious of these and wish I could design, and so I've started to post them. And then the plan is to eventually to start doing interviews with the people who've done the design to sort of get insight into people who do open source who are not necessarily engineers but are on the design side.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool project. You can check that out at beautifulopen.com. And the part that I really liked about it was the design itself is pretty minimal and nice, but because you're highlighting like well-designed projects, like your site sort of looks well-designed.
Yeah, it's all part of the plan to make me look like I know how to do design.
Exactly. So yeah, that's pretty cool. Next up on the news, ICANN has basically decided that countries don't own the TLDs that are named for them, like explicitly. They don't necessarily have jurisdiction over those. And this is really great news, because this is sort of a fear that I had with registering, and maybe it was unfounded to begin with, but registering those like ly and io and those other domains because they fit well into words, or it's just cool because io's like a technical bit of jargon. But you're always sort of back in the mind, like, what happens if the country that owns this doesn't like what I'm doing or tries to seize my domain? Like, is that a real threat? And ICANN has basically said that, no, that's not a real threat. This isn't something that countries get to own. So I think this is really great news. What do you think, Trek?
I feel bad for the People's Republic of Ninja, because my Trek.ninja site can no longer be ever claimed by them. But I think it's good news for the internet. It's weird.
Now we need Just start a country called that.
Ninjatopia. It's a small island off the Atlantic. Yeah, it's weird. ICANN is such a weird organization because it's like until recently was basically part of the pseudo part of the United States before breaking off and being kind of their own thing. So there was always like concern about what would happen, if they decided to start locking down stuff. And I feel like they've gone in the opposite direction, where now like top level domains are sort of eventually going to be whatever you like. Which brings back this not safe for work Saturday Night Live joke of clownpenis.fart. You familiar with that?
No.
I highly recommend people Google with safe search on clownpenis.fart as on YouTube. It's a pretty humorous joke from the early 2000s.
If you didn't
And now
mention-
that and now that the domains are sort of opened up to be anything, this may one day come true.
a dot fart TLD still seems a little far-fetched, but who knows?
I mean, .ninja also seems ridiculous, but there you go.
I don't know. So the last up on the news, we have there's this really interesting article on Ars Technica where one of the selling points of Android, whether the mass market knows it or not, but at least for a lot of the technical people, is that it's open source, at least at its core. It's an open source operating system. And that just gives you the warm fuzzies. So Ars Technica tried to basically run all of the open source software they could possible on their phone. And this turned out to be a challenge for them because even though the core of the operating system is open source, like a lot of the drivers are not, and a lot of the preloaded software is not. So they had to go through a lot of hoops just to try and get as open source as possible. And I really liked the way they laid it out. The image at the top also explains it very well. It shows like the apps list, and most of them have X's in them because they're not open source. So I think this is really a great way of basically educating people on, yes, Android itself, at least the core of it, might be open source, but that doesn't mean that everything you're running is open source. And if you actually want to adhere to that, it's not really the easiest thing to do. But they did have a couple of tips, including one that I've played with in the past that I like called F-Droid, and this basically gives you like a separate app center store where it only shows open source apps. So you can just search in there, and anything you see in there, you can be sure it's open source to some license. Maybe not your favorite one, but at least it's there. But at the end of the article, they basically said that, yeah, this is very difficult. The apps don't look cohesive as part of like a cohesive operating system because they're from different eras and different designers. But
it's interesting. Like the release of open source as like libraries and frameworks has obviously massively taken off in the past 15, 20 years. But like open source applications are still, like it's hard when there's no sort of project manager or product manager determining like what makes a good product, what makes a good visual design. Like it's very easy to toss sort of anything in. I think GIMP is probably the canonical example of like software development gone awry. Like incredibly useful photo editor, so incredibly useful that it's essentially useless. You also listed Firefox OS here. Have you ever gotten to play with that?
I haven't, but it was something else that people often mention because it's also an open source operating system.
I got to play with a demo phone at JSConf this year. And very early phone, so they were like, don't judge it by its speed or performance because it was pretty laggy as like a development phone. But it had like a very consistent look and feel. All the apps also were open and just sort of nice to work with. It would be nice to see an entire platform like this open up.
Yeah, for sure. It'll be interesting to see where that goes, for sure. But yeah, that's it for the news. So the primary topic for this week is how to run an open source project, both big and small. And I think this would be there's a lot of overlap between those two worlds, but there's also differences, and we'll want to talk about all of those. But we can focus on like several different aspects of this, like what actually goes inside of your repositories, like the different all caps files and what they mean and why you might pick one over another, like licenses and what goes into README. But we also probably want to talk about community and how do you handle reaching out to your audience, people actually using your tools and pulling on contributors. So maybe we'll just start with that documentation side. Maybe like a README is a really good place to start when you write a project, so maybe it's a good place to start with how to run one. So what do you guys think that really should go inside of a README?
I think one of the primary purposes of a README to me is to highlight your like target use case, right? So there's a lot of you know, on GitHub you got that description right at the top of your not part of the README, but a description of your repo, and that's a good like one-liner of what your project does, right? But I think the one of the best things you can highlight in your README is, you know, why this, right? What's the targeted audience, the targeted problem you're trying to solve with your project, and you know, so if you think you might be interested in a project and you scroll down and you see, oh, you know, that sounds like my problem, it kind of sells the project to people. So I feel like that's certainly important.
Do you feel like this holds up against like small and large projects?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a little more important for small projects. I feel like in larger projects, there's a greater chance of you knowing a little bit about the repository before you land there. So it's not as important. But definitely for small projects, when you know the likelihood of you hearing about it before you visit the project is pretty low.
I know on Ember we've really struggled to have a good README that like describes what the framework does in any meaningful way, and we've had like 4 or 5 versions, and they all like I don't really find them useful for like a big project like that. Like we tend to leverage the website much more, but for smaller projects, I definitely like that don't have sites. The README is kind of it.
Yeah, and for things, especially when your project is supposed to be a replacement or an alternative to something, say why. Like that's one of my biggest concerns when I see like this is a replacement for Express, but it still works with Connect middleware. I'm like, okay, well, why is this different from Express? Why did you make a different thing? And that's often missing from these types of projects.
Yeah, one of the things that we've tried to do with the Ember CLI project is basically have the README focused for development and developers. So it's basically how do you get started working on master? How do you, you know, npm link and these kinds of things, and then leave sort of the consumer-facing things to the website, which also has quite a lot of information, and then make sure to cross-link between the two. So that's something we've been toying around with. You know, like what Trek said on Ember, if you guys ever look at the main README of Ember, it's kind of stuff that either doesn't actually matter or things that is just not a good intro to the framework. Because how do you intro something that is, you know, a whole concept, you know, in just a few paragraphs? It's not simple.
Yeah, that's always tricky, and READMEs are kind of funny because they're called READMEs, but I hate reading READMEs. I prefer the verbo or the short, concise versions, and it can depend on the project. But I find that the most helpful READMEs, for me at least, are to, you know, I land on that GitHub page, I scroll down past the files, I see the name of the project. I want to know if it does what I need, a few bullet points, maybe the features, and then, you know, how it works. I would love to see if it's easy to use, just a couple little examples. And then that'll get my interest enough to really dive into documentation more, I think.
Yeah, if it's larger than like the smallest module, I like to use README as just, this is the landing page, and it has links to a bunch of other places that might explain things in more detail. But the README itself should be something that you could consume relatively quickly, and examples are a huge part of deciding whether or not that's something you actually need or want to use as well.
So I agree on links. I think most READMEs should have a lot more links. One thing that I would like to see in more READMEs is kind of a prior art or other solutions, or how does this compare to something else out there. So especially in the Node world, where you have a bunch of very small modules, there are a bunch that might tackle kind of the same problem space, but in different ways, or maybe it seems like there are a lot of things that are similar, but really highlighting the difference to other solutions can sometimes be an even better way for someone to decide whether or not the software that you've written will solve the problem that they have.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a
Any other
balance
thoughts
there,
on
though,
that?
right? Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Excellent. So there's a balance in that you don't want to send people off to competing projects and lose potential users. So making sure you frame it in the right way, I think, is really important. But just saying like, hey, actually, we copied these other people and changed one thing might be a little risky.
Well, so I come from a background of, I just write the software and I hope people use it. I think for a lot of like consultancies that might be dangerous, but at least in my case, like I honestly hope that if there's a better open source solution for someone's particular case, that they go out and use it. So honestly, there might be some applications that are better represented in Ember than Angular, for instance. And so I would rather someone go use the tool that solves their problem and makes them happy and works in a way similar to the way that they think, than have them sit on my issue tracker and complain that this doesn't work in exactly this way, when perhaps there's a solution that really agrees with their way of thinking.
Cool. I actually totally agree with that. Just I like to play some devil's advocate.
Yeah, that's the ideal. It can be hard to let go of something that you put a lot of work into, especially if you find out someone basically reproduced your project, maybe in a better way. So objectively, yeah, you should point them to the other thing, but selfishly, you don't really want to. And trying to recognize that can be difficult, but it does seem like it's better for everyone if you do point people to something that's going to serve them better.
Well, ultimately, that's what we all do is replace something came before us, right? I mean, Ember is replacing something. Angular, same situation. Every project is standing on the shoulders of the projects before it, and the things that come after it will be doing the same. So, to some extent, you have to both differentiate yourself from those, and also realize that you can't win all of the people over, or probably shouldn't want to. Otherwise, you're going to be, fighting too many battles and just dealing with too many potential fronts.
Yeah, definitely. Any other thoughts on READMEs? All right. Well, there's we can always come back to it if anyone thinks of anything, but there are other documents. I think we could just touch on licenses briefly, because I think a lot of people are probably familiar with this in the open source world, but just in case, licenses are incredibly important. If you don't attach a license to your project, then it has this default license that basically, I actually don't know the details, but it makes it harder to use for sure. So picking a license that's good for you is really important, and GitHub has started to make this easier. When you start a project, it'll ask you, like, what license do you want? Or if it sees you add a license file, it'll give you some options, and there are sites that help you pick them. I don't think there's much debate on that issue. You should basically just have a license file, probably link it from your README, just so that people can find it, and just make sure it's something that's going to work for you and your project. Because there are a lot of differences too. Like if you want to build something that you want to share, but you also want to reserve the right to monetize it yourself, like you might want a different license. So I think that's pretty important. Anyone have any thoughts on licenses? I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on that.
Yeah, I mean, licenses can be a contentious issue. I tend to default to MIT for personal projects just because I literally don't care what people do with my projects. If people want to make money off of it, awesome for them. And I actually do get pinged if I forget to put up a license. I would say within like a week or two of releasing a project, I get harassed by someone who's like, I would like to use this at work, but the lawyer people at my company say I must know what the license is. So that's changed. I feel like that did not start out that way. When I first started doing open source, I don't think people even cared about licenses, and recently it's become a thing where people will ask what the license is pretty quickly.
Yeah, the other thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes tools will populate a default license. Like if you do npm init to create a package JSON, it's actually going to have a license. I can't remember off the top of my head what the default is, but Bundler will do the same for GemSpec. So you'll have that, but I think it's actually still quite important to have the license file in your repo declaring specifically what it is, because oftentimes there's, you might use the short description in your package JSON to list it, but there's ambiguities and the exact wording of what you're following is not clear all the time.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure how much like the license line in your package.json holds up in some court. That'd be pretty interesting to hear.
Has there ever been a big lawsuit around open source technology where it's like it was released with a license that was published and somebody ended up suing? I can't think of it. All I can think of is like intellectual property issues with like horrible, patent troll companies, but very rarely around open source, small projects at least.
Well, I think sometimes the licenses are fragmented projects. We saw this kind of with TrueCrypt and OpenOffice, if I understand those situations correctly.
Yeah, I don't know of like specific high-profile cases, but it's definitely a problem for enterprise companies. I don't think it often gets raised to lawsuits, but it's usually some sort of compliance issue or just, yeah, employers wanted to make sure everything is, I mean, devs should want to make sure that everything is correct as well. You don't want to just make it sound like lawyers are trying to make us do things like we should care about this.
So for a big community, I know for my personal projects, I list myself as the copyright holder. But what is the process for larger projects where it's not starting out as a single author, or even ones that evolve, right? Like if one of my projects becomes wildly popular, do I update it to be copyright me plus everyone else who did stuff, or do I leave it just me?
I don't think anyone wants to give any legal advice.
Yes, I am not a lawyer.
But there was this really great talk by Aaron Kalin, and the link was just dropped in IRC, but it'll be in the show notes too, where they describe licenses and why you might want to pick one over another. Also, not a lawyer, but described it very well. So I encourage everyone to follow up on licensing and picking the best for them, for sure. All right, let's move to, I feel like these things start to grow and there's more and more I hear about every day. But another really important one that I've been trying to incorporate in my projects more recently is this contributing guide and code of conduct. And they really are separate because they're just separate concerns, but they're also sort of part of the same goal. Basically, if you, on GitHub specifically, and a lot of what we talk about is GitHub specific because it's just the easiest tool for sharing these open source projects, but this would apply regardless. But on GitHub specifically, if you have a contributing file in the root of your repository and someone wants to submit an issue or a pull request to your repository, they'll see this nice little flash message and it'll link to that so that they can read it to understand what you expect from contributors. And it's really useful, and in there I like to describe, you should always have, if it's a new feature, you should have tests around the feature. If it's just an issue, it'd be nice if you submitted a failing test as well, but you don't have to, something like that. But in there I also treat this as the landing page for how to contribute, and I also link to a code of conduct, which I also started doing more recently. And in there I've actually been using Index Coreline's contributor covenant. The link will be available as well. But I found this to be a really great, concise description of what we expect from project maintainers and project contributors and how they interact to make sure that that's something that people know about and that you can actually enforce.
So we kind of skipped over it, but it's related to licenses. Brian Ford, can you talk about the SLA stuff around Angular? I'm starting to see that more with large projects, especially ones that are run by corporations. you could talk a little bit about what it is, but like, how do you see it affecting contributions and people's participation?
Sure. So, sorry, you said SLA.
Yes. Every time I see an issue for Angular, there's someone replies with, you didn't do the magic spell that allows us to talk to you yet. Please go do that before we talk to you about this kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. So to kind of, I guess, simplify the complex legal issues around having like thousands of people contribute code to some single thing, Google has you sign something, and it's one of the nice things about this is it's once per person, and then it's shared across any of Google's open source projects. But it basically says that Google owns the code now, and Google owns the copyright for Angular, for instance. But you are free to use it under this certain license. And I don't know exactly all of the complexities around that. It sounds very scary, but I think it holds more water in court. It's really easy for Google or someone, if they get sued, to just have to defend on behalf of Google rather than on behalf of thousands of different people that have put code in here.
And then, other than the one little bit of back and forth you have to do, does it change people's participation at all, do you think, or like?
Not really. And one thing that's important to note is that this is only for source code changes. For documentation changes, we can merge those in right away. This is just for contributing source code. And what we find is because we have this whole process automated with a bot, people are, they immediately get the feedback that, oh, you need to sign this, and then we check, in the commit the email that they have versus the list of people that have signed this agreement. So it actually ends up being pretty painless for, I think, kind of a reasonable level of protection legally. But again, I'm not a lawyer. I have to do this disclaimer as well. As far as kind of mechanically how it affects things on GitHub, I have not yet seen a case where someone was unwilling to sign it. I think we have it basically as painless as it can be, and this was something that we worked on automating because we thought it was both important from a legal standpoint, but we really don't like to wrap end contributors up in red tape. So,
do you think this is something GitHub could add as a first-class citizen for functionality for projects that needed it? Would you like this to go away from being your problem?
That would be nice. I don't know if reasonably there's a good way to do it. There are a lot of kind of privacy concerns. Anytime you're submitting your email address, your name to some large database of people that are saying, oh, I'm giving you I'm giving away my rights to this thing that I did. Google couldn't expose this this database or this mechanism to GitHub. So if it was something where GitHub could more easily redirect people to this and then have them come back, that would be great. But I suspect that right now there's no great way to do this. So I don't know. It would be nice to have it solved, but I think there are plenty of other things on GitHub that I would be excited for them to improve before they get around to that.
Well, ideally, that GitHub could open up the commit status API to actually show in the UI more than the last commit status. That would allow you to have callback hooks that just add instead of the bot being a comment, it can be similar to the Travis link. That most people see. This is a problem we have when you have more than one CI servers. So if you have to run Windows builds versus, say, Travis builds, and then you do something else for Windows builds, only the last one wins, right? So this is a similar concept could work here. We just need a better way to represent that in the UI.
Yeah, totally agree. That's why we went the bot route right now, actually, because that ends up being a much better experience for people.
Agree. Yep. And the notifications are much better as well, because then you know they're getting the, however the notifications are set up, it's actually going to get sent to them.
Yep.
Yeah, we have pretty much the same experience at Facebook. We have a bot that comes in. It's all online and automated. Do you guys know if you're using the Apache CLA?
I actually have not looked at that document in a long time. I imagine so, because our lawyers really like Apache 2 license and these sort of things. So it might be a fork or a derivative of that, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was the case.
Cool. I think that's good. It's relatively low friction from my experience, and it's the same the same agreement that's being used throughout a lot of companies. So I think people are pretty familiar with it.
Yeah.
We haven't seen any issues with contributors being scared off by it at Facebook either. So.
That's good to know in case my corporate overlords ever decide to do this. We have somehow avoided the topic. I do not imagine that will last forever. At some point, we'll probably have a similar process. So it's nice to know that this is like a well-trodden, proven ground.
Yeah. Yeah, we have not had to deal with this yet for Ember, but at some point that may become a problem as well.
I'm kind of hoping it doesn't. I mean, I feel like community-run projects live in a kind of different world, and this will probably all come crashing down when the first gigantic lawsuit happens against a big community project versus one that's sort of under the auspices of a corporation. But for now, it's all friendly. So we were talking about stuff that GitHub could add. How do people feel GitHub does at managing projects of different scales? I know for large projects, I find it particularly cumbersome for a lot of stuff.
Yes.
Like what do you think they can add that would make it less useless?
So I was really happy with the issues redesign.
Mm-hmm.
It's still not perfect. One of my major issues is that I like to file an issue before any pull request comes in to fix a particular bug. It sort of keeps discussion in one place so you can decide what you're going to do before you actually do it. We see a lot of pull requests come in where like, hey, I fixed this thing. And I'm like, well, actually we wouldn't have done it that way if you had talked to us first.
Mm-hmm. So we have, on Ember, we copied this from Rust language, so I can't really claim this is good practice we came up with, but we actually have a repo on the Ember.js org site, or the org part of GitHub, which is like request for proposals, and we've started to begin putting people like, hey, if you want to change that's not just like something internal, but like big new features, or you want to break an existing feature, like there's a whole process you go through in a like specific style for doing an official proposal, and that like helps us organize, at least we hope, our discussions on the core team around like what we will accept and not accept. It's really painful, especially when it's like someone's first pull request to a project, to just be like, nope, and then close their pull request.
Yeah, I think the Python community has been doing that for a long time as well, and I think it's a great idea. So I'm excited to see how that turns out for you guys.
Yeah, I also like the idea. Right now, I think we struggle on Angular with there are so many different things that a pull request or an issue can mean, and so we end up having this enormous backlog of things, and it takes a long time for us to go through it every day and just make sure that what we are spending time on are the most important things. Or for instance, there wasn't some crazy security vulnerability that someone found, or some crazy memory leak in IE9 that popped up because of some esoteric change. Like, just going through that every day is really difficult. We've been adding more people and like giving them permissions to like triage and to add labels. But right now, GitHub only has one level of like permissions. Like you have write permission to add labels and also push, force push to master, or you have nothing. And so I think one thing on my wish list would be kind of a little bit more fine-grained control there. we've never really had any issues with anyone doing stuff like this, but it's nice to not have to worry about yet some other source of failure or source of people doing crazy things.
It's not even just maliciousness, right? Like you can't control an outside party whether they have two-factor auth on. Someone could compromise their account.
Yeah, exactly.
Awful things to your code base. It's I also wish GitHub had the same thing where we could delegate lieutenants to do, like we end up just giving people full access, but it would be nice to be able to, like, our release team would just have access to doing stuff on the website and maybe triaging issues and not necessarily like being able to put stuff or merge pull requests.
Yeah, this is a hard thing for a bunch of projects where they don't actually know what to, they don't want to give access to folks to push to the repo, which means that then they're stuck doing all the triage themselves. So and that basically leads to issues that could have been assigned or could have been labeled or could have been closed that end up being open just because of lack of resources.
So what about for the folks running slightly smaller projects? Like how do you get community to participate in sort of what access and control do you give them? Do you end up giving people commit bit, or do you just sort of centralize all that into yourself?
Yeah, so for me, for Connect assets, I don't generally give people push access, and that is it's not that I don't trust people. I just feel like I want to make sure that the project is going in the direction that I think it should be going in, and that being said, I don't generally reject pull requests, especially if it's a pull request with a serious change, something that's more substantial than just a doc change or something like that. But for me, it's nice to have that step where someone has to convince to you why this change should be made, and I think that's healthy from anyone's perspective. I don't generally make large changes without creating a pull request myself and pinging people on, people that I know that care about this particular section, whether or not they want to contribute or not. It's like if you've reported an issue about this particular problem, I'm gonna mention you on the pull request that's about it.
And I know
Sean, created or someone else.
Sean Massa does that too, and he always berates me for that I just straight up push to master if I own a project. I just consider it mine. I'm like, people will read the commits, it's gonna be fine. But I've actually gotten comments from people who have been like, why didn't you let me know this change was out?
Exactly, and anybody who's like GitHub has this great watchers thing, right? So anybody that's watching your project will get notified on pull requests if they have their notifications set up that way. So if you just push to master, no one sees that. But if you do a pull request and then merge it right away, like whatever, or once Travis finishes, hopefully, then at least people will get the notifications to see, hey, this thing happened. And they have a way to triage that without having to. I mean, how many projects do we all depend on every day? I would say it's probably at least a couple hundred. We can't all go to 100 repos and see what changes are.
So true. So I know, I don't know if people remember, it was maybe a couple years ago, but there was a sort of poorly reviewed commit to the competitor NPM, just called N by TJ Holowaychuk, where it rf user local. Has anyone ever had a similarly large gaffe in code, and how did you sort of deal with apologizing and dealing with that?
I don't know. I've definitely broken builds a bunch of times. I don't think that I've ever accidentally deleted people's data, but I think I've actually had people much more upset at me than the people that were upset at TJ for this over small changes in Angular, for instance. So breaking some pet edge case behavior of theirs, and I think. It's really easy to make mistakes on any sort of project. Even if you have allegedly perfect test coverage, there are still all sorts of behaviors that for instance you would never have thought of, but if someone's using your tool in a certain way, this behavior becomes kind of catastrophic. And so I think like the hard part here isn't dealing with code, because you can always revert a commit, right? And people can always back out to a previous version, or our tools are good enough that it's really easy from the code side to handle it. I think it's hard on GitHub when you suddenly have like an angry mob, like why'd you take this feature away, or why'd you change this in a certain way. I think getting the conversation so it's kind of healthy and constructive and more actionable, I think that's really tricky. One thing that I think is really difficult in open source is someone that's kind of being disproportionately angry or perhaps really rude, but they have a reasonable point as well. And so it's difficult to say like, hey, you're getting this really heated, and that's going to push away other people in the community that don't necessarily have the emotional bandwidth to kind of separate the useful parts from the angry pitchfork rant parts. And so saying being able to both acknowledge someone's concern and say, hey, we totally messed up here. We didn't realize to do this, but then also if you're upset about this, you have to communicate nicely here, because we cannot have conversations in a way that drives some people away because we're too charged about some certain thing. So that's happened a couple times with Angular. There's the notable underscore incident where we introduced a breaking change that said variables prefixed with an underscore in Angular expressions would not be available. And so the idea there was this makes it much easier to do a security audit. So for instance, you can be assured that certain expressions or certain things that on a parent scope or some certain context would never be used somewhere else. So obviously you don't need this feature, it's totally optional. But I guess MongoDB or one of these crazy things uses underscores all over the place. They have like underscore ID and underscore this and that. And so no one on the core team really used MongoDB, so we didn't realize that there was this crazy incompatibility. But we had to work really hard to figure out, is there a good workaround? What's the right way forward? In the midst of kind of this huge, angry mob of people on GitHub.
Yeah, that's maybe we could talk a little bit about how we communicate with the people using our projects. Like GitHub issues is one way, but a lot of projects also adopt IRC. It seems to be the most common one, but sometimes people use like Slack and HipChat and stuff like that too. So what are some good techniques for engaging with your community? Like I think at least having an IRC room or some sort of real-time way to communicate with people, especially if it's a medium to larger size projects, is really nice, because someone could just hop in and ask you a question, or you could even have more information there about the types of things you're doing, or maybe the core team discusses what's going to happen there. Yeah,
totally. So this is something that we try to do. It's a little bit difficult at times, but so Ember has Ember.js IRC room. We also have a development room. So we try to sort of patrol, if you will, IRC to make sure that there's always some folks that with knowledge kind of going around and doing things. I personally try to make sure to review every couple of hours just to go through the backlog and see what's going on. But we also do a ton of things like for messaging, like to indicate what's going on, like where things are at. Truck's been pretty awesome keeping minutes for the core team meetings that we've been having. Those published as blog posts. So we also do like release blog posts, things like that. So just try to message what's going on, where things are at. That's from like a general project standpoint. Clearly, there are things that everyone could do better, but I think that's a good start. And keeping people engaged, and also I find that keeping the real-time communication is way better and way faster than trying to back and forth ping pong in an issue. It's a lot easier to diffuse sort of what I would say are irate folks in IRC or in a chat or a quick hangout or something like that than it is to try to dissuade someone from a strongly held belief in like an issue back and forth.
So we also, Robert didn't mention, but the core team has a private Slack room where we do chatting, and we've gone back and forth on this. I think we had a campfire room, and then before we had IRC and there were not many users, so 4 years ago, and we just kept inviting more and more people to the campfire room, and it basically became a de facto public chat. And then there's a lot of noise in that. There's a lot of people asking how to get started questions, and the chat about how do we increase performance on this particular hot code path gets kind of lost in the how do I get started with a new Ember project. So we basically were like, all right, let's move everything to public and do IRC, and we did that. And then I think we overcorrected and had a bunch of the core team members just can't do IRC during the day. There's just too much noise there. So we just recently brought back sort of private chat, which is interesting. I think it's really useful for us as a core team. We get to sort of bond and talk high bandwidth internally. The flip side to that is I feel like you run the risk of people thinking special decisions are getting made in there that only the core team is privileged to, and that is definitely not true. But it's hard to shake that sort of oh, there's an elite back room where all the real decision making and planning happens.
Well, to some degree, you have to coordinate and communicate at a high level to decide direction and things like that, or to at least plan concepts of direction. This hopefully goes back to the RFC's repo that we have set up, where we can kind of make some ideas and some suggestions, some concepts, and say here's a request for proposal, I guess is what it stands for, where that's where the community can get involved and they can see what's coming down the pike and what major changes are happening. That's I think the hope.
Yeah, just to chime in, on Angular we have a kind of a similar approach. So most of the core team works in the same office in Google, but we do have a significant portion of our team that's outside of Google, and so we really try to document all the decisions and all of the rationale for everything. When you're trying to hash out details for something, it's not reasonable to do it through emails all of the time. But we do really try to do Hangouts. We have a couple kind of persistent Hangout IRC real-time messaging things, and then we summarize all of our meeting notes every week, and we also usually file kind of PRs or issues for our own things on GitHub when it's something really tied to the code, just that way we can make sure that we get feedback. But there's definitely this kind of tension between getting things done and making sure that things are publicly available, so that way the right people can get their feedback and get their voices in.
One of the things, going back to GitHub issues that we mentioned on the episode about getting started with open source as a new to open source developer, was that some projects like to do things like use labels that say noob friendly or something like that as a way of inviting newcomers to their projects. I think making good use of your labels is really helpful for communicating some meta information about the different issues that are out there.
Yeah, totally. The Ghost project does a killer job of this. Bugs are labeled as bugs. Things, they also use the milestones properly for upcoming stable releases and endpoint releases, and help set expectations for a given issue when it's going to be resolved. So it's great. You can go in and you can see, oh, this thing is tagged with Ember. This is an Ember-related bug for Ghost, or this is a backend thing, an API problem, things like that. So I think it makes it definitely more accessible. They also tag things for beginner when it's straightforward that this thing is relatively straightforward to fix. I think there's a potential for that. If it doesn't get picked, if you don't have contributors that are looking for things like that, there's a potential for that to sit there when in theory, because you've tagged it for beginner, it should be easy to fix. So there has to be a sort of a timeout where you have to pick it up and just take care of it, I think.
That's a good point. I came across a site a while ago called upforgrabs.net that basically has a huge aggregation of projects that are trying to publicize which issues are good for beginners, and so it has similar rankings. So the type of technologies used, like whether it's front end, back end, these sort of things. Then you can search based on your skill set if you're new to the open source world and you want to get started. So that's really cool, and I think they accept pull requests as well. So if Ember or something like that is not up on there, you can easily add it yourself. So this is useful for anyone running an open source project, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
What other stuff do you do? Like, how do you help onboard a new person to the project? We get a lot of comments are like, I'd really like to start participating, but I don't know how. And I've struggled to figure out, like, I mean, if that person's just unfamiliar with Git and a Git flow, or if it's like they're just unfamiliar with large projects. It seems like a lot of projects struggle with people who have energy and a lot of intent to participate being like disconnected from the people that could help them start participating.
Yeah, I think that this is really, really tricky. For Angular, even I think it's difficult because we use like a rebase workflow. So even if you are familiar with Git, a lot of projects you just hit the big green merge button, but we don't do that. We have a series of like CLI instructions that we use, and so I think it's particularly difficult for us even if we say, oh, you can help us merge documentation changes. You clearly know your stuff with Angular, and we have hundreds of issues in our backlog that you could easily help us merge or review and merge. And so the only way that we've been able to do it is if we find someone that's excited in helping, and we see them doing good work on GitHub, or asking lots of questions on the mailing list, or generally if they're spending some time to try and meet us, we try and meet them halfway. And so I spend a lot of time one-on-one, kind of teaching people usually just what our flow is for like triaging issues or for merging pull requests, and then from there they kind of get more experience, and then if they have time and interest, then they're basically core team members on Angular, and they can join all of our meetings and work with us on adding new features. Obviously, if they submit fixes or submit other things, we try and have people review all of it, but it's really helpful if they already understand our workflow and like our commit message formatting and how all of our tools play together and how our CI is set up and these sort of things.
So there's still a couple of things we want to cover before we have to go. So let's talk about there's this initiative I saw recently of adding this like security all caps file. I don't know what to call these, like security.md to your file to talk about security, and there's a privacy one as well. Does anyone have any experience with these things?
So in Ember we have a pretty specific security policy. It's not linked in the repo. It's linked on the main website, emberjs.com/security. But the way the security issues are reported, I think is pretty and handled is pretty important. I'm not sure. I know that all open source projects probably don't need a specific set policy, but things that certainly have the ability to expose data and things like that, cross-site scripting is a big deal, especially in front-end frameworks. It's very, very good to be out there in the front and open about how to report things securely, so that the teams can handle the bugs, release patches and updates for all affected versions or back as far as we support, and all that stuff all at the same time. It's a giant pain in the butt to do, but it's extremely important, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And this is, like you said, it's going to apply to those probably medium to larger size projects where you are often exposed to those types of things. But projects of all sizes should be thinking about this. Developers of all projects should be thinking about this and being aware of what the common holes are, but also just thinking about it in general. There was a recent advisory on a query string parsing module in Node that's basically because of the way sparse arrays work in JavaScript, you can very easily send someone a query string that just consumes all of their memory or blocks all processes from, or blocks the entire process from responding to other requests. And those types of things aren't, it's not like a cross-site scripting attack, it's not SQL injection, but it's still maybe not something that every developer should be able to easily discover, but those types of things you should be thinking about.
Well, and it's also about communicating how people can sort of subscribe to know when a vulnerability has been discovered. You know, like for Ember, we have a Google group. We have you can subscribe to or whatever, and get notified when we release those patches and things like that. So again, you're right. It's more medium size to large size framework or projects, but it's definitely important to at least have a plan or have an idea of how these things should be reported and handled. In the end.
Yeah, and the same for like privacy policies. If your project consumes personal information in some way, you should talk a little bit about like how you handle it and what your goals are, and maybe you sell that to third parties and you can say that, or maybe you never will and you can say that, and that'll put some people at ease when they come across your project for those types of concerns as well. All right, so let's also talk about the importance of releases and how you handle that. A lot of the projects we deal with in open source, the larger ones can be like applications, and the releases for those are different, but especially for libraries, I find like using strict SIMver, semantic versioning, has been something I've been trying to adopt more and more recently. And regardless of what you do, you should have like a consistent format, and you should communicate what that is for your version numbers, what you release and why. And you should start that right away. There was some recent discussion about this in the Node community on Twitter. Some people were suggesting that you start your project just at 1.0 so that you avoid like the nebulous less than 1.0, anything can go type of problems. But how do we deal with version releases?
So I'm sort of of the opinion that numbers are super cheap. So this is certainly depends on your project's deployment model. If it's a library which you don't necessarily anticipate people upgrading very regularly or very frequently, that might be different. But for Connect assets, I feel like every time you npm init a new project and include this module, you get the latest version. And if somebody wants to make a contribution to the module, there's a good chance that they want to use the contribution they've created. And so I'm sort of the opinion that yes, we follow strict SIMver, and I almost every time upon merging a pull request, when I'm done with working on the project for the day, I'll cut a new version that makes sense. So that helps me not only keep track of the change that's gone into it so that I can increment the appropriate version number, but it also helps people feel motivated because the changes that they've made have now been deployed to the project. And at the end of the day, it's just incrementing a number. It doesn't cost me anything. So.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I especially like small releases because if you find a problem with one, you can just tell people to lock to the previous release, and because you're doing small ones, you aren't missing out on a lot of extra changes that you've made, especially if they're bug fixes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one thing that's cool is with something like Travis CI, you can even automatically release anytime your tests pass. So I've been toying with the idea of, you could do some static or some dynamic analysis to figure out, when have API boundaries changed, and then you could even automatically determine what type of release to use if you're using semantic versioning. So I think that's really cool. I agree that things are cheap now, and so you really almost should be doing a release on every commit, unless you have kind of a crazy or highly cohesive project. I don't think that this works for something like Angular, for instance, which actually we don't use a very strict form of semver. Angular is kind of before the popularization of semver. So for a while we were actually doing the node style, where the minor number on even was stable and odd was unstable. We've since switched off of that, but the minor number for Angular is now kind of in spirit closer to what the major number should be. But we'll see. Our plan going forward is to do strict semver. So Angular 2 and up will be much more in the spirit of kind of what you see all of the popular libraries doing these days.
Yeah, and if anyone's not familiar with the different semver numbers and what they mean, definitely go to semver.org and read through that. It has a brief description up top and more detailed beyond that, but I found it incredibly useful for making sure that I'm using the latest software that people are providing, but also with an acceptable degree of change and the risk that comes with that.
Yeah, one thing that we do with Ember is we've got a consistent release process where we have a 6-week beta cycle, which leads to a final release, a stable release after that point. So that both gives us the ability to know that there's always another stable release coming down the pike, and it's relatively short. It's relatively near, so we don't try to rush things or try to push additional features into stable that maybe shouldn't be or aren't fully tested or fully vetted yet. But the other thing that it lets us do is make sure that we have a way to message when things have gone through that process. So we can increment the versions properly, and people can test things out. We also publish all builds for every passing Travis, or all assets for every passing Travis build for all of the channels. So beta and master and stable if there are any.
Yeah, that's a great point. For larger projects, communicating your release cycles and how they work is incredibly valuable. But let's move on to, for the last point of discussion, let's talk about a question that was raised in our IRC room. Basically asking, how do you sunset projects? Like, for some reason, you've decided that this project isn't used anymore, or you just don't want to maintain it. I guess those are two separate use cases. How do we deal with that?
Well, I hear now you can sell it for big money. Too soon? Too soon?
All if you revoke PR access.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a cheap shot. Let's move on.
So I have projects that I no longer want to maintain that also people. So before there was not that there really is a useful universal module system, but I had a very simple grunt plugin for requiring JavaScript files in order that was like not a manifest file. But now I usually use ES6 module format or CommonJS with Browserify. So like I actively do not recommend people use this software, and yet I'm sort of stuck with it because there are people using it who like have built apps and don't want to migrate them. So I don't know what to do. Like I want a big disclaimer, but I also want to leave up the repo and its documentation as like a resource for people currently using the project. But I don't like. Last one out, turn off the lights. I don't know how to resolve this stuff.
Yeah, you could actively try to find one of those contributors to take it over, or maybe just open an issue saying, looking for a new maintainer if you're interested.
I've done that on projects and no one ever bites. I don't think everyone wants to use open source and no one wants to usher it around.
Yeah.
So that's actually how I became maintainer of Connect Assets. Is that the original author, Trevor Burnham of the project, opened an issue on his repo and just said, hey, I don't have the throughput to manage this anymore, and I'm looking for someone to step up.
That's awesome. See, Trek, it can work.
If you're much better at open source than I am, apparently. So how did that transfer process go? Did it move under your personal account, or did you fork, or do you just have access to it on his account?
Yeah, so this was before GitHub made it easy. So basically what happened is it transferred over to my GitHub handle, and then he created a new repository at the old URL, which was just a blank repository with a link over to the new place. And it seems to have worked relatively well. I think now there's, if you don't know, there's a feature which allows you to move a repo with redirects now on GitHub, which is much nicer than before.
Any other suggestions for sunsetting projects?
So
I think.
go
ahead.
All right, I'll go. Then you go. I actually had someone totally re-implement one of my projects to overcome some major short-sightedness in my original design, and so that was awesome because all I had to do was say in mine like, hey, go use this guy's instead. Like I'm not going to support it anymore, and so it totally eased the transition of all this stuff. And he kept the APIs are mostly the same, and so it was kind of a drop-in replacement for some people. I think that's kind of the ideal sunsetting, is that someone someday is just like, hey, I really like this thing that you wrote, but you have these issues that we both know you can't resolve them without a total rewrite. So I went ahead and I did that, and here's the code, and it was great because I was mostly done working on that anyway. Yeah, so I think the trick is just to have someone else, magically do the work for you. That's the only solution. Check for your case where you had kind of a module system. It sounds like if you have, some adapters or some documentation on how you would migrate, maybe that's the best way to handle it. For systems like that, I think really that's the best that you can do is explain what are the downsides to this thing that I don't want to maintain anymore, and how can you start moving kind of piece by piece off of it onto something that's better. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. So what I was going to say was basically clearly message that assuming the situation, not that we've talked about this already, but assuming that this project is deprecated and there is no successor, or it just was a horrible idea to begin with, communicating that with basically adding something to your README saying, here, I don't recommend you use this. This isn't maintained anymore, and providing either documentation, links, information on how to, where a consumer can go from there. Obviously, you don't want to just abandon it and say "screw you" to everybody. That is horrible. But sometimes things were an experiment, or things were just didn't work out, or the plan was never realized, and there's no way forward. So in that case, I think you definitely want to message that so that future people, or even people today, don't try to pick up the project and use it when you know as a maintainer that this thing is horrible, and you would never suggest anyone actually do anything with it.
Awesome. So I think we should wrap up. We'll just go down the list and get some closing thoughts. So let's start with Andrew.
Yeah. So for me, I think the most important thing that you should try to take away from this is that being nice to your contributors is very important. So if that to your project means beefing up your contributing guide or beefing up your README, that's the only difference between open sourcing your code and maintaining an open source project is your first contributors. So go forth and treat people nice.
How about Brian?
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's one of these things where there's one of you and so many contributors or so many people interested. I think in order to kind of get the most out of open source, you really have to make sure that you're making this path as painless as possible for anyone that would be interested.
And Matt?
I had a comment about semantic versioning and releases. I just wanted to say at that point too, I think it depends on the community. For example, in the Go community, probably because of Go's kind of legendary stable 1.0 and their compatibility promises, the Go community doesn't just throw out version numbers for marketing reasons, and they're very careful generally to hit like a 1.0. If a Go project hits a 1.0, it means that it's going to be stable and maintained and supported, and it's more of a permanent thing, and that is really nice for helping the community gauge whether they should dive in and use that project, or if it's something that is maybe going to be a risk or a little bit more experimental for them. So just being careful with version numbers and really giving meaning to them, I think, is interesting.
And Robert?
Yeah, so I definitely, this was actually a lot of fun. I appreciate you guys having me on, and the discussion and sort of everyone's thoughts was really enlightening. I really like some of the ideas of people onboarding and getting going on how to pick up projects and whatnot. So I'm definitely going to take that forward and make things even better and easier.
Nice. And Paul had to go, so let's go with Trek.
I would say closing comment is to try and cultivate a group of sort of trusted people around your project. I know like nothing helps motivate me more and also picks up the slack when I'm off doing other things than like having people to be able to go and handle issues and do releases and put in useful features and then like come back to a project after a couple weeks of being busy and be like, oh, there's all this useful stuff that I would use and I didn't have to write any of it. It's kind of the best feeling in the world.
Yeah, for sure. And for me, it's all about that README. Like, just have some good, solid documentation on what you're doing. A lot of people like to write the README first and then actually implement the project, which I also think is great. Just make sure it has at least like a simple example of how to get started, what it does, and why you wrote it, and then expand from there, adding links to other files and whatnot. But communicating that is going to lead me to explore your project and see if it's actually useful for my use case. Without that, I might just quickly dismiss it and go to the next project that has a well-thought-out README. So that would definitely be the focus for me. But that is going to end this episode. Thanks to Trek and all of our awesome guests for joining this discussion on how to run those open source projects, big and small. Also, thanks to all of our viewers and the people in the IRC room, raising a lot of good questions. You can join us every single week at 9 p.m. Central Time on Wednesdays, except next week specifically will be on Monday, but you can follow the show at opensourcehangout.com, and all of those events will be posted there, and you'll always know what's coming up and when it is. And definitely send us any feedback on what you liked and what you didn't so that we can improve the show, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks.